You know, Easter has got to be the most miraculous day in history. And for the next several weeks, I want to help us prepare again for that great day by learning all we can about what Jesus did to make it happen. So I'm going to begin with an introduction for today's message. You know, I think the premise of Easter is simply this. God did what only God could do in order to do what only God could do. And here's what I mean by that. God saw that his created people were just racking up sin with no way to pay for that sin. You see, when we sin even a single time, it's something that separates us from God. And we have to live separated from God forever. God didn't want it to be that way. And that's why he sent his son Jesus to pay for our sin. God helped us in a way that only God could when he sent his son Jesus to make that substitutionary payment for our sin. But here's the deal. None of us would have believed that offer of his of a sin payment unless he did something really extraordinary to get our attention. So what did he do? He simply sent Jesus as a historic figure, supernatural, sacrificial, and very much predicted for hundreds of years before he arrived. What Jesus really did for us was against all odds, since the details of his time with us were very predictable. Hundreds of years before he was born, God sent a series of prophets to tell us what Jesus would do. One of them was Isaiah. He lived 700 years before Jesus, wrote one of the longest books of the Bible. He was one of the oldest living prophets. His ministry covered 60 years. And during that time, he wrote a chapter of prophecy. Chapter 53, with a couple of verses from the end of chapter 52. And as we continue talking about this, always keep in mind, this is 700 years before Jesus was born. So to begin, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to pretend I'm a prophet like Isaiah. I probably look a little bit like him too. I predict that the Utah Jazz are going to be NBA champions in 3 years. The Denver Broncos are going to win the Super Bowl within 5 years. The Dow Jones is going to hit 35,000 points in 3 years. England's going to actually exit the European Union. North Korea will relinquish their nuclear weapons in 3 years. Donald Trump will be re-elected in 2020. And Mike Pence will be elected president in 2024. Now, I'm not actually predicting any of those things. I just wanted to throw out 7 predictions to make a point. And the point is, what's the likelihood of any of those predictions for coming true? Well, if you think about it, probably not very likely on some of them, anyway. If I could get just a few of those correct, you would start consulting me as a stock market expert or maybe as a fantasy football expert, right? Well, several years ago, a mathematician tried to actually calculate the probability that Jesus could fulfill all the prophecies of the Old Testament. And from studying the Bible, he knew that there were more than 300 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled in his lifetime. So his task was to calculate the probability that anyone could fulfill that many predictions hundreds of years into the future. So what is the probability that one man could fulfill 300 biblical predictions? Well, here's the truth. You will never know. It can't be calculated. When the mathematician got to the prophecies, 8 prophecies, not 300, but when his calculations arrived at fulfilling 8 prophecies, the number was so large that he had to use an analogy to explain the number because it's meaningless. It's 1 times 10 to the 17th. There is an English word for it. It's called 100 quadrillion. And to appreciate how large this number is, here's how he put it. He said, imagine the state of Texas. And you know how many square miles are in the state of Texas? You fill Texas 2 feet deep with silver dollars. And then you mark 1 silver dollar with a red X. And then you mix them all up, and you have a person draw that red X silver dollar on the first try. What a visual. That's the probability that anyone could fulfill 8 prophecies hundreds of years later. Now, my point wasn't to bore you to death with numbers. I wanted to impress you with how impossible it was for Jesus to accomplish 300 prophecies hundreds of years into the future. We can't even calculate what that probability might be. So in our text for today, written some 700 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah recorded 24 predictions in our text, our lesson. And all 24 of those predictions came true. What are the odds? I want to talk about just a few examples of his predictions. And I'm going to start with this one at the tail end of chapter 52. See, my servant will act wisely. And if you look at the Hebrew word for act wisely, it can be interpreted act wisely in the context of being successful. It's the result of acting wisely. So being successful, he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. So according to Isaiah, one day God would send his servant to earth, and that servant would act wisely, would be successful. Well, that's pretty easy to accomplish because lots of people are successful, aren't they? So God clarifies further. He said this servant is not going to only be successful, but he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. So let's look at Revelation 1:17 and see what Jesus is today. The Apostle John wrote this, and it's part of a vision. So John fell at Jesus' feet, though dead. And then he, Jesus, placed his right hand on me and said, don't be afraid. I'm the first and the last. I'm the living one. I was dead, and now look. I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. I would say that's exalted. Prophecy fulfilled. Jesus was successful and was exalted. However, there were moments when it didn't look like any of Jesus' life was going to be successful. Look at verse 14. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Why were they appalled? Well, it was because Jesus was so badly beaten that he became almost unrecognizable. One of the most dramatic examples that you could imagine was the film, The Passion of Christ. If you saw that film, I guarantee you, you still have that vision of Jesus Christ and the punishment he took in your mind. We saw that 10 years ago or more. I cannot get that vision out of my mind. prophecy fulfilled. Jesus was disfigured. Well, the next one I'll pick on is verse 2 of chapter 53. He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. So here's the unique thing. He grew up. Nobody in their right mind, when thinking about the Messiah, would have expected him to come as a baby. But God, through Isaiah, said Jesus was going to come as a baby. Prophecy, Jesus grew up. In these first few verses of Isaiah, there are 4 prophecies, of which I spoke of 3. In the last 10 verses in chapter 53, there's actually 20 prophecies. And I'm going to sample just a couple of more as we're talking through this. This one is verse 3. He was despised and rejected, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. You know, the Sanhedrin rejected Christ 3 times in 3 different trials before he was actually crucified. And the majority of the people rejected Jesus when Pilate asked him publicly, "You want me to release Jesus, or you want me to release Barabbas?" And what did the crowd yell? Barabbas. And what did they yell with Jesus? Crucify him. Prophecy. Jesus was despised and rejected. Verse 4, Isaiah says, the Messiah will take up our pain and bore our suffering. This was true from the very first days of Jesus' ministry, wasn't it? Everywhere Jesus went, he bore people's sicknesses by healing them, carried their pains by counseling with them. The prophecy, Jesus bore our suffering. And then the second half of verse 4. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. You may remember, we've talked about this in the past, on the Day of Atonement, a special goat called the scapegoat would be brought into the temple. And he would be stricken by the sins of the people. And they would tie a red sash around the forehead of that goat. And the high priest then would lead that goat out into the desert. It's symbolic of all of the people's sins being taken from them. This scapegoat was called Azazel, the Hebrew word. In John 19:15, Pilate asked if he should release Jesus, and part of what the crowd shouted that John recorded was Azazel, which is translated literally, take him away. Prophecy, Jesus was stricken. Verse 5, Isaiah says, the Messiah would be pierced for our transgressions. He would be crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we then are healed. Matthew records actually, that's the next one, sorry. Jesus was crucified between 2 criminals on the afternoon before Passover. You know, normally it took 2 or 3 days for somebody to suffocate being nailed to a cross, being crucified. But Passover was coming. This was Good Friday. And at dark, Passover was coming. And the Jews didn't want anybody to be suffering pain at the start of Passover. So the Roman guards broke the legs of the 2 criminals on either side of Jesus so they would suffocate sooner, die sooner. But when they got to Jesus, they didn't break his legs. You see, he was already dead. But just to make sure, they pierced his heart with a spear. So instead of Breaking his legs, they pierced him. Prophecy, Jesus was pierced. And then in verse 7, Isaiah said the Messiah was oppressed and afflicted. Yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, he did not open his mouth. Matthew records that during Jesus' trials, multiple trials, he never defended himself. He never confronted his accusers. He remained silent. Prophecies, Jesus remained silent and led like a lamb to the slaughter. And if we skip to the very last prophecy in chapter 53, he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressions. What did Jesus pray? One of his 7 last words on the cross. Father, forgive them. Who was he talking about? He was talking about the people that put him there, that executed the order to crucify him. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He even forgave the thief on the cross. Today you shall be with me in paradise, when the thief asked him. Prophecy. Jesus interceded for his accusers. So after just this sample of 10 prophecies that we see were clearly fulfilled by Jesus, can't we conclude with absolute certainty that Jesus' death was historic, supernatural, sacrificial, and predicted? Especially since it's mathematically impossible for a person to fulfill 10 prophecies made hundreds of years before. But lest anyone be tempted to believe that it was a giant accident, remember again that Isaiah wrote these prophecies 700 years before Jesus was born. What are the odds? You know, author Ernest Gordon wrote the story of the miracle on River Kwai. It was about some Scottish soldiers who were in a prison camp. They were being forced to build a railroad in the jungle by the Japanese. Under the strain of that captivity, that group of men had degenerated into a group of barbarians until one day a shovel went missing. And that camp commander got so enraged that he stood before that squadron of men and he said, I want that shovel. Nobody moved. He took out his pistol and he said, you produce that shovel or I will shoot every one of you. About that time, one of the men stepped forward. That camp commander put his pistol away, but he picked up a shovel and he proceeded to beat that man to death. When it was over, the rest of the men picked up that bloody body and they carried it with them to the second tool check. This time, no shovel was missing. It was a miscount. There never was a missing shovel. Well, the word spread like wildfire through that camp that an innocent man had come forward to save the lives of all the men that he was in that camp with. What a heroic act. It had transformed every person that was in that camp. When those prisoners were finally liberated by the Allies, they found a group of human skeletons who treated each other with such dignity and respect. These men even forgave their captors. No more killing, no more hatred. The effect of one who died for them had taught them such a valuable lesson on how to love. This is the story of Jesus. This is the story of Isaiah 53. You know, we're going to celebrate this story again on Easter. And I pray that you will invite your family and friends to hear the story of the one who loved them against all odds. The one who died for them against all odds. And the one who rose from the dead against all odds to give them the opportunity to experience eternal life. Amen.